Y'all wanting to learn about a Mesopotamian story featuring a sort of chaos dragon? I got you. The life advice we're supposed to get out of that story? Not so much. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to this Cognitive Psychologist series on Beyond Order. This is the second part of Who You Could Be. The first part involved a lengthy discussion over a piece of alchemical art and the proposed inherent symbolism therein, and Quidditch. Because of course Harry Potter factored in. Why wouldn't he? It's not the last Harry Potter will show up in this chapter, by the way. Sean's rolling video will be assigned viewing before that video, trust. The gist behind Who You Could Be Part 1 was basically Jungian growth and order can come out of dealing with chaos. Remember, this book is supposed to be about moving beyond order, but here we are, still starting from a place of chaos and moving into order. The second part focuses on the Enuma Elish. By the time we're done with this video, you will be thoroughly versed on that story. Hopefully you're as into myth as I am. Also, to address the chaos dragon in the room, this is now live on my merch store. It's my cuddly chaos line based on our resident chaos dragon, and we've got mugs with the dragon a little bit lower because this was my test print, but chaos life, you know it, what? Stickers in a couple sizes, hoodies in the same super soft material, adult t-shirts, kid t-shirts, including little baby things if you have a cuddly chaos bringer of your own. I only have the furry variety, so that's who's modeling it on the merch store. Right. So, visual shorthand to indicate who is talking. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science. Just small. So small. A little bit of science. In this video, the majority of the shot is going to go to discussing myths. But in Peterson's world, stories are just as solid as empirical research and evidence for backing up psychological claims. On with the show. With the section title, Polytheism into Monotheism and the Emergence of the Virtuous Hero, Who You Could Be. How could you possibly go wrong? Now we are going to attempt a description of who you could be from another perspective, taken from one of the earliest stories we have been fortunate enough to rediscover. In the ancient Mesopotamian Enuma Elish translation, When on High, we have the oldest, near-complete hero myth known, estimated at 4,000 years of age in its written form and, no doubt, far older as an oral tradition. This is one maddening inconsistency in Peterson's work. What he calls the oldest or earliest story seems to change based on what argument he's trying to make. In 12 Rules, towards the end, he said it was the Enuma Elish, but earlier in the book, he'd said it was the Bible's creation myth. Hopefully y'all are keen for a side of history in addition to the myth main course, because I stumbled across this on TV tropes and I found it interesting. And also because Peterson doesn't provide any sort of reference or context for this, so I had to do some sleuthing. Also, I am a cognitive psychologist by training, not a historian, so if I get some details or something wrong, do let me know in the comments. Also, Wikipedia is going to be doing some pretty heavy lifting here. I could try to disguise that fact by including the references from the Wikipedia article instead of the Wikipedia article itself, but let's be real here. This is a YouTube video where I'm talking about something outside of my professional lane. Wikipedia is a good enough starting point. One thing to note is what we call Mesopotamia actually changed hands many times. The main powerhouses rotated between the Uruk, Akkadians, Sumerians, Babylonians, and so on. This is important to note because the different city-states had variants on what we collectively call the Mesopotamian religion. For example, the goddess Tiamat was Babylonian, doesn't really show up outside the Enuma Elish, and doesn't seem to have been the focus of worship. It's possible she was replacing the Sumerian Namu, who maybe had a temple, but possibly not. For context by way of example, Inanna was a pretty important Mesopotamian goddess, associated with love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and political power. From that list, you know rock and roll would have been in there if they had electric guitars back then. The Queen of Heaven was Inanna to the Sumerians, but later to the Akkadians and on as Ishtar, She had temples all over the place, and her worship only really died out with the rise of Christianity. For total transparency, I picked her because I can probably pronounce her name, but she apparently showed up in more myths than any other Mesopotamian deity, in part because of her propensity for attempted godly corporate takeovers. My point here is that yes, Tiamat was basically a chaos goddess in the Enuma Elish, but the relative cultural importance of that particular story may not be all that big in the historical grand scheme of things. But as I said earlier, I am talking out of my specialization. It's entirely possible Tiamat didn't receive the same devotion as other deities because her deal was done and dusted by the nature of her role in this creation story. But the Babylonians, who she belonged to, were relatively late in the Mesopotamian power chair. Maybe it doesn't matter how impactful or important this story was. Peterson's comment about rediscovering the story is valid. These stories, and the containing archaeological sites, were only dug up in the mid-1800s. Prior to that, there were only partial or summarized retellings of the story. That said, I'm not sure where Peterson's getting the 4,000-year estimate from. Not saying it can't be that old, just saying the age details are complicated. Right, with that out of the way, Peterson says the Enuma Elish kicks off with Tiamat, a saltwater dragon goddess, banging Apsu, a freshwater god, and their bang products were the initial realm of being and the first round of kids. For some reason, instead of continuing the story, Peterson launches into a discussion we saw in 12 Rules, the ancient assumptions that are proposed to be almost alien to modern people. This time, it's framed as the fundamentals of ancient belief. The first ancient assumption is that before science became more formalized, reality was construed as all that which human beings experience, as opposed to objective reality. Peterson explains the difference between subjective and objective reality for a bit, but I'm sure you can imagine the gist. Subjective reality is through the lens of our personal experience, objective reality is not. The second ancient assumption is the fundamentally social nature of our cognitive categories, and the explanation here relies on the personification we do of things in children's stories that we continue on into adulthood.
We directly and naturally perceive reality as personified, and then must work very diligently to strip that personification away so that we can detect objective reality. We understand reality, therefore, as if it is constructed of personalities. This is part of the reason science developed so long after religion and ritual, so incredibly recently, and by no means everywhere at once.
Maybe if he supplied references, I'd have a better idea of what he's talking about with this personalities business. Looking at when this idea showed up in 12 Rules, he referenced things like Gibson, stuff exploring the link between language and the motor cortex for the hands, and what he called a hyperactive agency detector. Of these, the only one that actually deals with our tendency to treat inanimate things as having agency is the last one, and even that says nothing of personalities. Now, it's possible he's interchanging a general assumption that things have their own vibe going on with personalities. In 12 Rules, the specifics for what we generally ascribe agency to were not included, and I think those details are important, and potentially not supportive of this point. Perhaps letting him continue will provide us with more clarity. It won't, but maybe.
That is because so much of what we encounter in our hypersocial reality, our complex societies, is in fact personality, and gendered personality at that, reflecting the billion years or so since the emergence of sexual reproduction. We understand male and abstract from that masculine. We understand female and abstract from that the feminine. Finally, we understand the child and abstract from that, most commonly, the son. These basic divisions are clearly reflected in the creation story of the Enuma Elish, just as they are reflected in, or more accurately, underpin, our understanding of the stories we all know.
Of course, in Peterson's framework, the personality categories are male, female, and male offspring. Of course, this is nothing new for him. But why is son the most common abstraction of child? What in the primordial undivided universe does he mean by understanding sex and abstracting gender from that? That our understandings of masculine and feminine come from how people who are assigned male and female at birth generally act? Because I'm pretty sure there's a cultural mediator there. Although, this is basically his proposed fundamental category of male or female again, in close to the same format. Last time it was in the treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping rule, whereas this time it's for trying to live a better life as inspired by stories, so it's not entirely recycled content, although it's pretty damn close. I don't have the intellectual endurance to rehash everything from last time, so check out the originals Rule 2 videos for that. Peterson's point here about the fundamental categories is undercut a little by the story not really going into how men and women were created, just mankind. Oh well, whatever. Back to the story.
Tiamat, the primordial goddess, is chaos, a female monster, a dragon. She is the terror of nature, creative and destructive, mother and slayer of us all. Apsu, her husband, is the eternal father. He is the order that we depend on for security, and by which we are simultaneously tyrannized. These two most primal of deities come together in a productive sexual union, mingling their waters, in the ancient words.
Here's a good place to lodge a complaint. He doesn't have a solid reference for the Enuma Elish. There hasn't been a single reference in this section so far. In a couple pages, he'll reference maps of meaning for this among other things. Nested references again? Bad Peterson. No, not in your book. Do it in a blog. Based on my comment history, I can imagine a response to this. This is not an academic work, and so it doesn't need to reference things in the academic standard. But what if a reader is legitimately interested in finding out more about the story? What if Peterson's helping kick off a passion for mythology by talking about this? Wouldn't it make sense to give them a springboard to just jump in with instead of referring them to a book that they'd have to buy in order to get access to those references? Anyways, looking through the chapter's reference list, it can be inferred that he's working from the 1965 Babylonian Genesis. Why that only gets to be referenced when Peterson directly quotes from it is beyond me. Maybe he got feedback on 12 Rules that had too many references and it bummed people out or something. We could talk about this reference when Peterson actually bothers to cite it, but I'm not that patient. The book says it contains a complete translation of the various Babylonian creation stories from cuneiform, along with info on the tablets worked from. Eventually Peterson will cite particular tablets, but we're spending a little time here because I'm intrigued by what's in the rest of this book. The Babylonian stories in Greek? How these creation accounts relate to the Bible's Old Testament? Tell me more. In the preface, it's interestingly noted that the Bible cannot be considered a singular work. The influence of neighboring cultures has to be considered. The author, Heidel, indicates that this book is primarily targeted at Old Testament scholars and Christian ministers, and he will constrain himself to things that would be useful for people entrusted with the office of expounding the sacred truths enshrined in Holy Writ. Just popping in here with a little comment that'll be important in contextualizing this book and its interpretations. Heidel's Wikipedia page includes a little something about how his argument about the uniqueness of Genesis have been overturned in the subsequent years. It would have been neat for the wiki to support that comment, so it goes. At the start of the book proper, he says people are interested in the Enuma Elish because it provides info on the Mesopotamian view of how the world came into being, as well as the similarities it has to the biblical Genesis. Heidel helpfully gives us a Cliff's Notes version of the story. In the beginning, there was just Apsu, Tiamat, and their kid Momu. I've seen this elsewhere, but it's argued that Apsu being the sweet water and Tiamat the salt water is reflective of the importance of the major rivers, bearing fresh water, and the sea for enabling agriculture. So those waters were mingling, and that mingling brought about more offspring, and those offspring had offspring. The divine youths partied too hard and made their dad homicidally mad. Tiamat tried to get him to brush it off. Some summaries include that Tiamat warned Ea, one of their grandkids, about Apsu's getting ready to kill them all, but that doesn't seem to be in the tablets. Ea somehow figured out what was up, put Apsu to sleep before killing him, then setting up shop and living on his corpse with the other deities. Ea and his wife popped out Marduk, who was extra godly, total Chad of a god. It's worth mentioning and highlighting and emphasizing that Marduk was a patron deity of Babylon, so him being the super special awesome guy in this Babylonian myth makes sense. Meanwhile, Tiamat became more and more unhappy and, according to Heidel's summary, was encouraged to seek revenge for Apsu's death by Kingu. A separate summary includes that Marduk was annoying the shit out of Tiamat and that Marduk's generation were not giving proper consideration to their elders. Tiamat agrees it's wartime, produced monsters for her army, and promoted Kingu, giving him the Tablets of Destiny. Heidel's personal belief system seems to be bleeding into a summary here. Rebel gods, despite Tiamat and company controlling the I'm the King tablets and being part of the original ruling couple. Demonic host. Okie dokie. Tiamat, the Jungian terrible mother she was, wouldn't listen to reason, only the application of physical force. It's interesting, looking at his translation of the tablets later in the book. The relevant one here has Anu being sent to Tiamat to try and calm her down after Ea failed in some manner that's lost to time. Anu got to Tiamat, perceived the strategic plan of Tiamat, and not being able to withstand her, he turned back. Anu goes home, tail between his legs, prompting his dad to say, "No god, whatever, can go to battle and escape with his life from the presence of Tiamat." Doesn't fully mesh with Heidel's description of things. Also, the other summary I'm comparing Heidel against includes explicit mention of Tiamat's army non-lethally wiping the floor with the younger gods. Heidel just goes from Tiamat births a monster army, she wouldn't be reasoned with, let's go get Marduk. No mention of the fighting until later. Interesting distinction that I'm not entirely sure the implications of. Marduk, the extra godly one from earlier, is summoned because he is extra godly and whatever. He agrees to fight Tiamat and her army, but on the condition he gets to be top god when he's done. After some pageantry, Marduk is equipped and sent off to do his thing. Dramatic battlefield stuff, Marduk challenges Tiamat. And again, Heidel's description of things seems to lean into the emotional, hysterical women's idea. Other summaries describe her just as furious, as well as Heidel's tablet translation, although she later gets goaded into a frenzy by Marduk. Granted, we are all products of our time to some extent, but given some of the things Peterson said, I think it's worth noting Heidel's word choice here. Anyways, fight, Marduk kills Tiamat, then makes a world out of her corpse, sets up the celestial house, and created man from the blood of King U. Yay, Marduk. Heidel lays out some of the potential goals of the Enuma Elish, like legitimizing Marduk as chief god and fluffing up the importance of Babylon. Then there's some discussion about the origins of the epic, like how much of it was new and how much of it was updating earlier myths, roughly when the myth was originated, and speculation about why it was part of the New Year celebration. Following that is the Enuma Elish translation itself, a chapter on other Babylonian creation stories, and finally, a chapter on parallels with the Old Testament, specifically if it's appropriate to say that the Old Testament's creation story was built off the Babylonian one. There's a lot of microscopic analysis of the two works, with Heidel's conclusion frequently being that the Old Testament writers may have known about the Enuma Elish, and it may have had influences in some parts, but it categorically did not in Genesis. The book ends with Heidel assuring the reader that even if the Enuma Elish did impact the writing of the Old Testament, it was part of God's plan. Oh, I may have forgotten to mention that publication of this book was funded by part of the Lutheran Church in the US. That does help explain the framing a bit. So yeah, that's Pearson's eventual reference for this story. Where were we? Right! I was complaining about Peterson not providing a source for the Enuma Elish at the point he started diving into the material. Peterson is talking about the story as providing an example of a hero story, and also that we perceive the world in terms of personalities. That the Enuma Elish demonstrates the fundamental sex category boxes he's so fond of. Having gone through the myth, we can take another look at his initial description of Tiamat and Apsu. How dragony Tiamat was is apparently a matter of some debate. Heidel thinks she wasn't exclusively depicted as a dragon, others do, so we'll leave it at that. But it seems like Apsu and Tiamat were content to just vibe, mingling their waters until their kids got too loud. Speaking of,
these gods represent elements of the world more differentiated than the primordial mother and father, such as heaven and earth, mud and silt, and war and fire. However, they are also careless, noisy, and impulsive as 2-year-old children, who are, after all, primal forces in their own right. Their continual, ceaseless, thoughtless activity and general unconsciousness culminates in a catastrophe. Their mutual decision to wage war upon and then slay Apsu, and consequent attempt to build a stable dwelling place on his corpse.
Wait, what? He skipped a couple steps here. The way he's told it, it sounds like the kids just decided to do a fratricide one day because of their thoughtless, unconscious ways. Not that it was a you can't kill me if you're dead kind of thing. Also, this comment about 2-year-olds being primal forces of nature compels me to remind you, dear viewer, about Peterson's own described standoff with his 2-year-old son when said son wasn't able to adequately feed himself. At 2. One can be forgiven for wondering if Peterson thinks he'd be able to get these baby gods under control. Peterson describes Tiamat, chaos itself, as wanting to deal with her children because of the brainless racket they're making. Plus that whole thing of killing their dad and her former husband. So she makes her monster army, installs King U as the head of that army and her new husband, and gives him the Tablet of Destinies.
The relationship between this brilliant dramatic representation and how we use, or misuse, the gifts of our culture is obvious. The careless demolition of tradition is the invitation of the re-emergence of chaos. When ignorance destroys culture, monsters will emerge.
What? Were the kid gods the ones who demolished tradition by preemptively killing their dad? By killing one of the OGs, they were ignorantly destroying culture? I feel like that's the only way that can be interpreted to make sense, but what? Was there really a tradition being demolished at that point? And all of that needs to be couched in the fact that we're dealing with a creation myth that, probably at least in part, existed to divinely validate the Babylonian power structure. While Tiamat's arranging her army, the gods boink and make more gods, including Marduk. He is born with eyes encircling his head. He can see everywhere. He can speak magic words. These description points aren't surprising given Peterson's emphasis on sight, vision, and the power of the word in 12 Rules. While Marduk is busy growing up, the other gods confront Tiamat but fail to defeat her. So at some point, Marduk is volunteered for this task. But he wants the Tablet of Destinies if he does so, and to sit atop the dominance hierarchy of the gods. He just glossed over so much tradition in the form of pageantry, or the conducts that Marduk was the patron god of Babylon, which might help explain his chosen one status. But he also skipped Tiamat's inability to be reasoned with at that point, so moving on. Hope you have your bullshit waiters handy.
It is in this manner that this ancient story describes the emergence of monotheism out of polytheism. Enuma Elish appears to be a dramatized account of the psychological or spiritual processes comprising this transformation.
Right, yeah, totally. Because all polytheistic religions are just waiting for the right thing to happen to let them evolve into a monotheistic one. Or that this is a transformation that should happen. Before getting into Peterson's explanation, this reminds me of a sort of religious trigger for my mom. She was raised Lutheran, had a bit of an ideological falling out with the church since then, but the religious schooling can kick in when the topic of Catholics and saints comes up. The basic idea is that the way saints are treated by Catholics borders on polytheism, which is bad. Although even in the Protestant branches of Christianity, the bit about the Trinity can be a bit unmono. Like, you've got one God, but there's three aspects. But it's one God, but there's three. All I'm saying is that the gold standard monotheistic religions in the US can be a bit polycurious.
The ancient Mesopotamian civilization faced the necessity of incorporating and unifying many diverse tribes and peoples, each of whom had their own gods. The god who arose out of the conflict between all those gods, whose god is supreme, was therefore a metagod, a god composed of what was most important about all gods. It was for this reason, for example, that 50 different names characterized Marduk.
Verifying Peterson's explanation for the 50 names of Marduk is proving to be a little tricky. Idle says the 50 things were titles with all the attributes and abilities of the various gods of the pantheon, thus making his way preeminent. The University of Pennsylvania Ancient Mesopotamian website says that these 50 names were previously Enlil's, who was top dog for those preceding the Babylonians. Following that lead brings us to Wikipedia, which says the number 50 was sacred to Enlil, but not why. A possible why comes from encyclopedia.com, which indicates that the gods were assigned numbers, indicating they're spot on, to use Peterson's beloved phrasing, the dominance hierarchy. Enlil's was apparently 50. Not because he or Marduk were a syncretic amalgam of 50 preceding gods, but because of some priestly cuneiform shorthanding. Peterson's talking about the Mesopotamians in a way that would work for something with a shorter timescale. But remember, dear viewer, we are talking about thousands of years here. Also recall that Mesopotamia wasn't a singular civilization. It was much more complex and in flux than that. This also makes it sound like the sort of incorporation the early Christians did to try to get the pagans into joining up because, hey, we've got the same holidays and stuff. That's pretty cool, right? Our vibe isn't going to try to eventually erase your vibe from existence. Why would you think that?
This emergence of one from many is a very common process, described by the scholar of myth Mircea Eliade as the war of the gods in heaven, a typical mythological motif, as well as alluded to earlier.
So he can name drop this mythological scholar but not provide any sort of citation. Super fucking helpful, Doc. I was initially going to let the scholar slide without comment, but my Discord had some choice words about him, and I'd never heard of him, so briefly. Eliade was a Romanian religious historian, active in the last century. The big thing associated with him was the idea of eternal return. That, quoting Wikipedia because my brain is fully in chickens on the moon mode, myths and rituals do not simply commemorate hierophanies, or a manifestation of the sacred, but, at least to the minds of the religious, actually participate in them. He has some theoretical overlap with Jung's collective unconscious and Joseph Campbell's monomyth. Eliade's work is not without criticism, as he tended to overgeneralize to make mythic examples or religious roles fit his framework, or the missing empirical support for his theory. Then there's also the general Orientalism for non-Western religions, and his connection to the Iron Guard, a Romanian fascist group, so... Correct me if I'm wrong, but the godly battles I can think of off the top of my head, so the Greeks throwing down with the Titans, or the Norse Ragnarok, don't lead to an emergence of one from many. Then there's that footnote. Divorced from further context, I'm not sure what the traditional motto for the US has to do with anything.
It is the psychological counterpart, in the world of imagination, to the genuine struggle of concepts of divinity and value on Earth. Tribes unite, each has its gods. The people comprising these multitudinous groups go to war, concretely and conceptually, for what they believe, sometimes for generations. It is as if the gods they follow were battling for dominance over periods exceeding single human lives, using their followers as proxies. This is reflected in the ancient stories. If and when the gods come to an agreement about their relative positions, or particularly if they arrange themselves into a hierarchy, it means that peace has genuinely been established, because peace is the establishment of a shared hierarchy of divinity, of value. Thus, an eternal question emerges whenever people of different backgrounds are required to deal with one another on a relatively permanent basis. What do all the gods share that makes them gods? What is God, in essence?
That as if is a high load-bearing beam here. The commingling of belief structures that happen after conflict is an interesting window into how the peoples are interacting. But this hierarchical structure may not be reflecting the jointly agreed upon belief system so much as what is allowed to remain by the dominant and/or colonizing group. Just because there isn't active fighting doesn't mean that things are peaceful. Peterson says that this what is God question is hard, because it's a question of what is most important, but also what principle should rule. Because this is so difficult, the question of God took millennia to puzzle out, and the answer was delivered in story form, because of course it was.
The Mesopotamians brilliantly intuited that the highest God, the highest good, involved careful attention, the multiple head-circling eyes of Marduk, and effective language, the magic words of Marduk, capable of generating a cosmos, in addition to the courage and strength to voluntarily confront and overcome chaos, the unknown. It could be argued that these are the defining features of the great central spirit of mankind, at least insofar as that spirit is noble and admirable.
That's one way to interpret everything, I suppose. To be pedantic, I'll just mention that one of the groups to take power after Babylon were the Assyrians, who had Ashur as their chief god, not Marduk. Was Tiamat representative of the unknown? Chaos, sure, I can buy that. But the unknown? Pivoting to the ancient Egyptians now, he hits on similar points as from 12 Rules. The savior god Horus was associated with the falcon. Thereby, he was linked to vision capable of rooting out evil.
Representing that reality, pay attention above all, even to what is monstrous and malevolent, and speak wisely and truthfully, could be the single most important accomplishment of our species. It allows us to apprehend, in dramatic form, the fundamental necessity of coming to grips with what our senses demonstrate to us, no matter how terrifying the reality revealed. It allows for the possibility of bringing our explicit understanding closer in line with our deepest being, making possible a truer union of body and spirit through the partial comprehension and imitation of the story. Most importantly, perhaps, it allows us to realize the immense importance of words in transforming potential into actuality, and helps us understand that the role we each play in that transformation is in some vital sense akin to the divine.
Ooh. He just put a reference. He just put a reference. He just put a reference. Let's see what it is. I don't know why I'm pretending to be excited here. I've already mentioned it's a Maps of Meaning plug. Control Fing my way through his mom, looking for Mesopotamia, highlights how much of that book is being incorporated into Beyond Order. Pulling out the parts of the Enuma Elish that fit his argument, Marduk winning meaning that order triumphs over chaos, and the 50 names of Marduk reflecting a monotheistic shift, followed by Egyptians doing similar stuff with language and vision. Same ideas being repackaged into a new book cover. My Jung whistle detector's being tripped by this explicit understanding aligning with deepest being part. Not that this whole part isn't a deepity wrapped in style madness. But of course, the only way we can accomplish this sort of quasi-mystical growth is by imitating stories. It's kind of weird that Peterson already talked about the 50 names of Marduk, but that comes at the end of the story, and we're diving back in. Peterson quickly talks about Marduk defeating Tiamat and making the world from her corpse, and he notes that men did this literally with the bones and skins from animals. So he can include a reference for the mammoth bones being used in this way, but not any of the other things I've complained about so far. Cool. This is also the point where he finally references where he's pulling his translation of the Enuma Elish from, and possibly only because he's directly quoting it. Proper source handling at its finest. Unlike this mouse handling, yeah. That is handled. Marduk defeats the army, yoinks the tablets of destiny, heads home, sets about putting everything and everyone in order, and then,
after consulting Ea, the god of wisdom, Marduk determines to create man, to aid the gods most fundamentally in the eternal task of maintaining the proper balance between order and chaos, to release those very gods from their service, and to transfer their burden onto our all-too-human shoulders. Ea makes man from the blood of Kingu, the most terrible of Tiamat's monsters. A bright graduate student and later colleague of mine once suggested that this was because of all God's creatures, only man could deceive, only man could voluntarily bring evil and discord into the world.
Again, cognitive psychologist, not somebody trained in any mythic stuff. But we can take a peek at Heidel's translation for the creation of man. Marduk has finished arranging the heavens and whatnot, then his heart prompts him to create ingenious things. He talks to Ea about wanting to make man. Upon him shall the services of the gods be imposed that they may be at rest, then ingeniously, hierarchically and physically arranging the gods. Ea is like, bruh, how about you kill the surviving god who championed the fighting? The gods are summoned. Marduk says we're cool as long as we off the one who created the strife. Kingu, Tiamat's second husband, was the one, so he's bled out and man was created. Ea imposed the services of the gods upon them, and the other gods who supported Tiamat were freed. Ea is credited with creating people, their service to the gods is reiterated, and then I'm not sure what that work was not suited to human understanding means. Maybe the bigger divine plan behind everything? Ea made people from Marduk's plan, then Marduk divided the gods into above and below groups, and they're given decree guard duty. They want to show their gratitude for being freed from compulsory service, so make spaces for the New Year's festival, with back support. And Marduk says this will be Babylon. The gods make it and their shrines, have a party. Skipping to the next man mention, I imagine his high priesthood is referring to people. Marduk is humanity's shepherd, they need to worship and fear him, and then it launches into the 50 names. I don't see anything here about maintaining the balance between order and chaos. Being labor for the gods, sure, but not balance keepers. And yeah, this is just a story. A very, very old story, but a story nonetheless. Does it really matter if Peterson's adding extra meaning that isn't actually in the text? To that, I would say if he's going to use this ancient story as support for his argument that we can learn the true nature of reality through stories, he'd better get the fucking details right. It is, after all, an ancient story, passed to us across time and space. According to Peterson, that makes it a tried and true thing that needs to not be tampered with. And what is this about Kingu's blood granting the ability to do evil? Don't let this sweet facade fool you. Animals can be plenty deceptive and contradictory. Bright student, my ass.
The basic story is this. When order, Apsu, is carelessly threatened or destroyed, the terrible forces of chaos from which the world was originally derived appear once again in their most destructive, monstrous, predatory guise. Then a hero, representing the highest of values, must arise or be elected to confront this chaotic force. He does so successfully, deriving or producing something of great worth.
Yeah, this is the basic hero story, with some extra layers of meaning baked in by Peterson. We've talked about this before, but I personally get more enjoyment out of stories where the hero isn't an exemplar of everything good and true, or when the highest values aren't actually the right solution to the problem. I keep bringing this up, but I think it's important to keep in mind. Marduk was the chosen one in the Enuma Elish because he was Babylon's baby boy. In stories from the other city-states, Enlil was the most important, or Ashur, or whoever else. It seems like Peterson's just chucking the cultural context aside in order to get these deep, revelatory meanings from these stories. This great worth production. Besides saving the world or whatever, what tends to be made in these stories? To give Peterson the home turf, let's work with Harry Potter. At the very, very end, bad guy gets defeated through a magical rule loophole. Then Harry goes on to such great feats as becoming a magical cop and sending his offspring to his alma mater. The banality of this ending seems like it should have been disappointing to fans.
What that hero represents is the most important of the great forces that make up the human psyche. To think of it another way, the hero is the embodied principle of action and perception that must rule over all the primordial psychological elements of lust, rage, hunger, thirst, terror, and joy. For chaos to remain effectively at bay, or even better, tamed and therefore harnessed, this heroic principle must be regarded as the most important of all things that can organize and motivate mankind. This means, at least, that it must be continually acted out, which is what regarded as important actually means.
So Marduk possesses people who create and renew society, or possesses kids who get their personality coherent. What? It's like I'm sitting here in front of an overly fancy dessert with a spoon, and there's just so much going on that I'm paralyzed by choice. There is a lot to be said about the relative structuring of cognition and drives, but this ain't it, Chief. And I've said it before. In this, Peterson is still very much operating from inside order, despite all of his claims that he's actually working from the balance point between order and chaos. Chaos needs to be kept at bay or domesticated. It can't be allowed to exist without ordered constraints. Chaos must always be put into service of order. But the important thing in this quote is probably the heroic principle. What exactly is this heroic principle? He's talking about like it's a thing that has been clearly identified, but I don't think it has been. I'm flipping back through this chapter to see if I've missed something, but I don't think I have. There's something about you possibly being part of the eternal force that confronts the terrible unknown, that faces chaos and turns it into productive order, or shaking up restrictive order. There was a meaning he pulled from the Harry Potter position in Quidditch, but that feels more like an aside to a heroic principle than it in its entirety. The alchemy summary was about how to develop an ideal personality, so the heroic principle wasn't in that section. The closest I think he comes to laying out this heroic principle is in Marduk's vision and language. Now, I know what he's getting at with these because of the lengthier explanation for them in 12 Rules, but the explanation of them is relatively lacking in Beyond Order. To be precise in my own speech, at least, it seems weird that Peterson's leaving this heroic principle at such a vague level. For a writing project like this book is, I was taught that you need to be very clear and precise in what your point is, revisit it or reiterate it often so that your message comes across clearly. But what do I know? I am not a daddy to lobsters around the world. Peterson recounts the story of St. George, Dragon Slayer. The dragon demanded sacrifices on the regular, and people went along with it until their beloved princess was chosen, and that was apparently a bridge too far. Peterson emphasizes St. George's use of the cross on his shield when confronting the dragon, as it is the symbol of the eternal redeemer, the archetypal hero. And St. George killing the dragon is a victory over chaos and evil.
The cross, for its part, is the burden of life. It is a place of betrayal, torture, and death. It is therefore a fundamental symbol of mortal vulnerability. In the Christian drama, it is also the place where vulnerability is transcended as a consequence of its acceptance. This voluntary acceptance is also equivalent to victory over the dragon, representing the chaos, death, and the unknown. By accepting life's suffering, therefore, evil may be overcome. The alternative is hell, at least in its psychological form. Rage, resentment, and the desire for revenge and destruction.
The quoted part of this feels similar to something in 12 Rules. Could be said for a lot of this book. In the last book's overture, Peterson described a dream he had while writing Maps of Meaning. In it, he was floating in a cathedral and therefore also at the center of the building's cross shape. This meant he was at the point of greatest suffering, the point of death and transformation, and try as he might, he couldn't get away from that spot. The meaning he eventually pulled from the stream was that existence at that cross is suffering and transformation, and that fact, above all, needs to be voluntarily accepted. It's possible to find sufficient meaning in individual consciousness and experience. I don't disagree that life comes with a lot of suffering, because it does. I don't know if I'd say the way to cope with it is to just accept it, though. For instance, my current health situation is coming with a heaping dose of assorted suffering. Just a suffering buffet, if you will. And I feel like if I just accepted it, that means I would lose the fight to find out a diagnosis for everything that's going on, or to stop trying to get adequate treatment for the pain. Peterson would quite possibly hate this, but I would describe my philosophy as trying to live my best life in spite of the suffering. Doing anything less than that would be letting the suffering win, and I can't have that. Finally, for completeness, St. George is apparently one of the more popular saints. He may have been a Christian Roman soldier who was killed in a purge of Christians from the ranks. This taking place in roughly the 4th century Common Era, it wouldn't have been a clean death. The dragon story seems to have been added to him roughly a millennia later, but was quite popular in the chivalry circles. Peterson continues to rattle off other stories that share similar arcs, like St. George, St. Michael, The Hobbit, Beowulf, Perseus, Pinocchio, and Iron Man. His description for these are Peterson-y, but otherwise not really notable, aside from emphasizing the characters who died and were later reborn, like Pinocchio or Iron Man, or calling the Loki that appeared in the Avengers satanic, which is a choice.
It must be understood. Such stories would not even be comprehensible, not least to children as well as adults, if our evolutionary history had importantly differed, and if our entire culture had not been shaped, implicitly and explicitly, by these ancient patterns.
Fucking what? Saying that these stories wouldn't be understandable if our evolutionary history had importantly differed begs the question of how. This video is apparently just full of these, but I've said it before. Evolutionary psychology at its meh-ist, not even at its worst, but meh, is largely a collection of just so stories. Post hoc explanations for why we are how we are. That is what Peterson's doing here. Except not really, because he's not doing the work of armchair psychologizing what the other paths would be and how we'd be different. Just that we wouldn't be able to understand these stories because reasons. This seems like a good point as any to highlight Peterson's apparent belief structure for stories here. It seems like he views stories as these relatively static, independent entities. Sure, there's some wiggle room while the story's being figured out initially, but after that point, it is a thing unto itself and relatively independent from the world or our ability to change it. Which fits for his Jungian background. The idea that these stories reflect the hidden collective knowledge of our species, and that knowledge can only be sussed out by examining these stories through a depth psychology lens. But the thing is, we don't have sufficient reason to believe that's the true purpose behind these stories. If anything, we have more evidence on the interplay between us and the stories we tell. Basically, stories don't create the culture, as Peterson seems to indicate. The culture, and the people living in it, create the stories. But we aren't done with the evolutionary storytelling just yet, and we're at the last paragraph for this section, so you know the style madness is going to be pretty deep at this point.
All these heroes act out what was perhaps the greatest discovery ever made by man's primordial ancestors. If you have the vision and the courage, and a good stout stick when necessary, you can chase away the worst of the snakes.
His ability to superimpose metaphor and literal interpretations at the same time never ceases to amaze me. Tool use does tend to be a pretty big deal for the species who can employ them. And in certain evolutionary constraints, surviving species tend to have the visual capacity to deal with their predators or other hazards, otherwise they won't be surviving for much longer. But we can never forget the high importance Peterson has placed on vision in all of its symbolic or literal forms.
No doubt, the greatest of our ancestors were beginning to threaten snakes with sticks when we still lived in trees. No doubt, it was those voluntary snake-chasing ancestors who reaped the benefits of their bravery in the form of nearby grateful maidens, or their ancestral arboreal equivalents. And perhaps this is why dragons hoard virgins, as well as gold.
To do a little armchair Evo psych myself, I always felt like there's a bit of a trade-off for slightly stupid bravery. Like sure, Those snake chasers may have been fending off breeding partners with their snake stick, but there's also the chance that the next snake might be their last. If the entire species is willing to charge headlong into danger, you better have quick replacement to keep the population numbers up. Otherwise, if you have a species where some are willing to chase off the snakes and maybe die in the process, and others prefer to keep a respectful distance of the snakes, I think you're going to have a more well-rounded species that isn't just going to yeet itself off the population cliff. But why is any of this a potential explanation for why dragons hoard virgins? It couldn't possibly be that our culture, among others, has put the sexual purity of women at a very, very high premium, and that is being reflected in these stories.
What constitutes the worst of all snakes and the stoutest of all sticks, however, might be regarded as the central religious questions of humanity. It is interesting to note that in The Hobbit, the worst snake is only a dragon, but in The Lord of the Rings, the worst snake, so to speak, is the much more abstract evil of the wizard Sauron. As humanity became more sophisticated in its capacity to abstract, we increasingly appreciated the fact that predatory monsters can come in many guises, only some of which are animal in their form. Literature of an arguably more sophisticated form endlessly echoes this realization.
I swear, he used to wait until the end of the chapter to unleash this level of style madness, but apparently we get it at the end of every section now. Why is the shift in Tolkien's villain reflective of humanity's purported shift in villain portrayals? The Hobbit came first, The Lord of the Rings came second. The Hobbit was a standalone story, The Lord of the Rings wasn't. Having a more complex villain for 3 whole books as opposed to like a little book makes sense. Nah, this echoes an increase in our ability to abstract concepts, like evil. I'm pretty sure that as long as there's been an us, we've understood that others of us could be predatory monsters. At some point in our species' history, we became a larger threat to ourselves than defensive snakes or animals looking for a furless snack. And to pull a little armchair evolutionary psychology myself, I'd guess that this conspecific threat detection predates humanity. How many animals have social protocols for approaching each other that involves figuring out if the other animal is friendly or not? Sophisticated my ass. Hopefully I'll remember this for the next video, but he's setting up all this snake stuff because the first part of the next section is on Harry Potter and all the snake stuff there, and how it reflects some Jungian life lesson. Also, it's unclear if Peterson's saying that Harry Potter is more sophisticated than The Lord of the Rings. It can be so hard to glean his meaning sometimes. Recall, dear viewer, that this was the second section of the Who You Could Be portion of imagining who you could be and then aiming single-mindedly at that. That the Babylonian story we spent all that time on was to support Peterson's claim that we need to honor tradition, but also illustrating a psychological transformation into a more sophisticated mode of being. That even polytheistic religions aren't really polytheistic because of how the pantheons are structured. That we need to pay attention and not lie. Apparently we weren't paying sufficient attention because these were already rules from the original 12. If I wasn't a bit of a mythology geek, we probably would have glossed over more of the specifics in the story. But I do think it's interesting and a bit informative which parts Peterson emphasizes or how he chooses to interpret things. And what is this little series of mine if we're not digging so far into the source material that we're coming out the other side of the globe? Anyways, this is a portion of a video where I typically give you my take or alternate advice, and yeah, I don't think I have anything here. There wasn't really any advice or lessons in this section, just a lot of pointing at stories and then hand-waving about how they reveal the importance of paying attention and categorically never lying. So yeah, I guess, pay attention to stuff, but also this hard rule about never lying doesn't seem realistic. It's a good heuristic to be as honest as you can be about things, but life is complicated. Sometimes you can't necessarily be straightforward about things. Demanding truth from people in all situations seems like it's just going to lead to suffering. Whew. Guess I did have something to say after all. Anyway, till next time. Bye.